If you are a real estate agent who wants to stay ahead of the curve and protect your income, stay tuned. Today, we are diving into one of the most critical topics in our industry about how to navigate the NAR settlement changes and ensure that you are fully prepared for what's coming. Hey, Ravi with Elevate Agents, where we provide meaningful, relevant, and educational content to help real estate agents thrive. Now, thank you for stopping by. Now, let's be real. The NAR settlement has shaken things up big time, especially when it comes to buyer agent compensation. But guess what? The agents who are prepared and informed will not only survive, but thrive in this new landscape. Now that's why I'm sharing a game-changing resource just for you. 26 scenarios that every agent must learn to navigate. And trust me, you won't want to miss this. But before we jump into those 26 crucial scenarios, I need to ask two things of you. First, hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so that you don't miss the valuable content that could help transform your real estate business. And second, if you are serious about leveling up, check out the link in the description below to access the full Real Buyer Playbook. It's packed with insights that will help you stay on top of your game. Sharan Srivatsa, president of Real Broker, and the state-designated brokers of California, Florida, and New Jersey got together to share the 26 most common scenarios that agents need to be aware of with respect to the NAR settlement. Now, this set of scenarios is by no means all-encompassing, but pretty much covers a broad range for you to be equipped with the knowledge necessary. Now, the rest of this video is about all of them getting together and brainstorming these scenarios and giving you clear, actionable steps so that you not only are successful, but are staying informed. So let's go.
Hi, my name is Sharan Srivatsa, and I serve as the president of Real. I'm super excited to do this very special breakdown with some of my friends and my partners who are our designated state brokers, who can give you a window into what we're calling the agent success scenarios. 26 scenarios that every single agent must know to kickstart their process of learning about all these post-NAR changes that are coming. By no means is this list exhaustive, is designed as a kickstart, is a jumpstart for you to just get the understanding of scenarios. Otherwise, it's hard to figure out what to actually do. So before we get started, let me make some quick introductions. We have Ms. Rebecca Redmond, who is our designated state broker in Florida. We also have Mr. Jason Lopez, who is our managing broker in the state of California. And we have Mr. Eric Axelson, who is our designated broker in New Jersey. And Eric and Jason and Rebecca have been the cornerstone of us thinking and building and growing this and navigating this new environment. So Eric, Rebecca, Jason, so grateful that you're here, and thank you so much for being with us. So here's the agenda, if it's cool with all of you. I think that we should pick one of these scenarios, and then maybe I'll kick it to one of you. Please give us your state-by-state kind of state perspective on it. And if the other folks realize that there's a different nuance to it, let's share. But please know that we don't have all our states represented here, but this should give you some guidance and directional guidance. Once you have this, you'll know the spirit of how different states are approaching it, but use this as a starting point to learn more about each state. So Rebecca, Jason, Eric, did I frame this right for us? Anything else you want to say before we kick this off?
I think that's a great start.
Okay, awesome. Well, let's get started. So we have two sections of this. We have these process-based scenarios and these compensation-based scenarios. Ms. Rebecca, I'll start with you. Let's start with the question that is on everyone's mind right now, which is a buyer representation agreement or a written agreement required before touring homes with a buyer in the go-forward world?
It's a super straightforward answer. The answer is yes. There are no exceptions. If you are going to show a buyer a house, then absolutely you need a written agreement of some sort between you and the buyer before you step foot in that house.
Awesome. Jason, Eric, anything else that you're seeing? Because I know you're get asked this question. It's very specific. Any other nuance to this?
Just highlight what she said. It's some form of written agreement. It can be pretty bare bones. Check with your state broker and your state association realtors. There may be a showing agreement or touring agreement that is legal in your state.
Yeah. I will not spend too much time on this. I'll actually maybe put this in the show notes. I was talking to our counsel about this, but we're noticing about four types of broad agreements. One is this touring agreement that is even offered by Zillow and the other companies that are helping people kind of see these homes. We're going to come up with our own to give this to our agents. The second is a state-specific, Jason talked about a non-exclusive agreement in different states, which are state-specific showing agreement to actually see the home. Then you have this buyer representation agreement, which I know Eric and Rebecca, you've talked about adjusting the scope of these, maybe for a particular property or set of properties, or even reducing the timeline to ensure that the buyer feels comfortable. Or last but not least, when you've had a game plan conversation, you're into a full-fledged buyer representation agreement. So it seems like there's a few different ways, but it's important for us to know the tools that we have access to so we can represent our clients well.
Yeah, cool. Good point. And, again, every state being a little bit different. I know some states, like here in California, they put out a pretty extensive packet of new and revised forms. So we do have, obviously, the full-blown buyer rep agreement. We have a limited version that's, specific for just a few homes. Even an open house non-agency form that's almost set up like an open house check-in list, right, where people can sign in. But the real important part of that is whether or not they choose to sign in is it gives us an opportunity to just make them aware of what the new rules are and kind of cover the bases that way. And then, of course, the kind of the showing or touring agreement. So, it'd be nice if we have maybe something similar that will be blanket for most of our states. But again, in each state, it's going to be, I think, pretty well done through the state forms. Yeah.
By the way, I will say this as a notice to folks watching this. Real's finalizing developing state-specific showing agreements. So we're on the docket to having all 50 state-specific showing agreements. That is easy for folks to actually have the first gateway conversation. So we thought that was a fundamental thing that we should put out there as well. So that's cool. Let's go to number 2. Jason, I'll kick this to you. What if a buyer refuses to sign some form of this agreement? How should we approach that conversation?
I think every agent's going to have some thought on that in terms of a business decision they're going to have to make, right? Nobody's going to want to work for free. I think there's an option there if you want to go look at, some a handful of properties, again, using the limited buyer rep agreement that gives them an option because you're going to need to have it one way or another. So it's like you mentioned, that consultation and having that business discussion with them about what it looks like now in this new world. They're going to have to sign an agreement with somebody. So there's that limited form that's, more like, hey, let's date a little bit before we move in together or whatever, and see if we're going to be a good fit for each other, and to give the agent an opportunity to kind of show their value, right, moving forward with that agreement. But there is a lot of talk about maybe agents trying to go around the buyer's agents directly to the listing agent. Probably going to happen. But that listing agent isn't necessarily going to rep that buyer, right? It could be a non-representation agreement where that buyer's on their own. And that's going to probably cause some problems because, it's that old saying about hiring yourself as an attorney, as an example, right? As a fool for a client. So I think, but I think there will be circumstances where buyers may not be comfortable because I'm going to have to pay for this if the seller won't do it, right? So there'll be some business decisions agents are going to have to make along the way based on the scenario.
Yeah. Awesome. Eric, maybe if I can take number 3 to you. So if I'm a listing, this is probably one of the more common questions we get asked. If I'm a listing agent for a property, what if my marketing generates an inquiry from a buyer that wants to see the home? Would I have to get a buyer agreement signed the minute I meet them before I show them the home? How does that work?
Yeah, no, the NAR settlement's pretty clear. In scenario, you're working for the seller. You're marketing and showing and opening the door to that property. So you do not need a written agency agreement. And I'll add, if you're showing for a friend at your brokerage, as long as you're still at the same brokerage, depending on your state's laws, you should still be covered without needing that document.
Eric, but what happens if, I am not at the brokerage and I am not the listing agent? And I get maybe an online buyer inquiry to go show a home that is listed by another brokerage. Would I need a buyer rep agreement for that or some written agreement for that?
Yeah, that's where the previous question kicks in. You 100% need some form of written agreement before stepping foot in property with a buyer.
Perfect. Awesome. All right, here's question number 4. Does the requirement, Rebecca, maybe to you, does the requirement to use a written buyer agreement before residential showings also apply to commercial transactions?
So as it stands right now, which I strongly believe there's going to be lots of pivots and changes and adds as this sort of rolls out in its full extent, the commercial transactions are void of needing this requirement. It's not an unusual concept for commercial transactions to negotiate the commissions separately anyway. So it's quite a normal practice in the commercial world, but as it stands under the NAR settlement, no, the buyer rep agreement is not needed on commercial transactions.
Yeah. And the crazy part is, Jason will tell you this, commercial already kind of does it this way. Mm-hmm. So they sometimes they feel a little ahead of us. So good job, commercial folks. Here's number 5. If an agent hosts an open house, this is very similar to the question that Eric got asked. So Jason, maybe your comments on this. If an agent hosts an open house or provides access to a property on behalf of the seller only to an unrepresented buyer, will they be required to enter into a written agreement with those touring the home?
No, they wouldn't be required if they're doing work on behalf of the seller. However, again, in each state, it's going to be a little bit different. We do have this open house non-agency form that we can provide that just says, hey, here's the new rules we're living with now, and I need to let you know about that. If you decide you want to pursue this and have me as your agent, we will discuss, the buyer rep agreement going forward at that point. But you're free to come in, and if you don't want me to represent you, you want to make an offer, we have a form for that as well, the buyer non-agency form. And in that case, it states very clearly that I represent the seller, I do not represent you, and anything you say is not confidential and will be used against you when the negotiations kick off. But you do not need that buyer agreement at that point.
Yeah, it's a lot of folks have been asking us this. Hey, our open house is going away, et cetera. No, we're not. There's not that friction introduced at all. You're still working for the seller, so you're in the clear.
That solves a lot of problems where buyers show up, or people come to look at open houses and they don't tell you that they have an agent. The buyer rep agreements and even the listing agreements now have language in them that says, "Hey, do you have an agent? Have you signed an agreement?" So it's out there and should be a little bit clearer about that. So hopefully more buyers will just say, "Hey, I have an agent. I've signed an agreement," and eliminate some of that confusion.
Yeah, absolutely right. All right. Eric, do these new rules apply to rentals? We talked about commercial, but rentals or only for sales?
The NAR settlement only applies to residential sales. Due to technology, though, the commission is being removed for rentals as well in most MLSs.
Yeah.
I will say, pay attention to your own state's laws, though. Some states are enacting laws to sort of piggyback on this. And so, for example, in New Jersey, you now do need a written agreement before showing rentals. So please, please, please check with your company's broker in your state.
Yeah, absolutely right. Eric, we'll say one more on this one.
On top.
Go ahead, Jason.
Really quick on top of that, with not just new laws kicking in necessarily in states, but also updated MLS policies and rules. I think a lot of people are going to get caught up in that with the offer of compensation being removed. So there are MLS policies as well, and new fine structures and things of that nature for agents. So pay attention to what your MLS is doing. In many states, there are multiple MLSs, and they all have maybe a little variation between their rules. So it's really important that you follow what the MLS is laying out for you guys as well.
Jason, I'm so glad you mentioned that. The big reason why our team put this draft of this document together was if you can just go through these scenarios and you can quickly, hey, how do I solve this thing? How do I solve that thing? You write down the fines. In a very fast way, you can get ahead of the curve. So that's why we've created these scenarios for you. Eric, I'll go back to you on this one. As a listing agent in discussions with the seller, if the seller agrees to offer, say, a 3%, as a buyer representation compensation, is the intent to do that, do you memorialize that somewhere? I know it varies in state forms. California is different. How do we memorialize the intent to offer seller directed buyer compensation?
For the most part, I think in most states, 100%, nothing has changed with this. Any terms you negotiate with your seller regarding compensation, you definitely want to put in writing in one document. So the listing agreement.
Awesome. Jason, I know that in California, this is a little different. How, especially with the, kind of the traditional cooperation removed? Yeah,
with our new listing agreement in California, it totally removes any discussion about what is being offered to the buyer broker. So you're now in a listing appointment only discussing your commission in terms of the seller paying the listing broker, right? It does have a little clause in there about if an unrepresented buyer shows up, how is that going to work? And because that listing agent would have to do additional work that normally that buyer's agent would do, there's a section to add a little bit more that can be negotiated with the seller to offset, the cost of having or the time that listing agent might have to show up and do things that normally that buyer's agent would do. We do have a new document as well in California that specifically where the seller instructs the listing agent to go ahead and market and advertise that they are willing to have some seller-directed compensation to cover the buyer. And what we've been talking about in the additional terms here in California in the listing agreement is maybe add something in there as well, like, seller authorizes agent to market X amount, just not, or wherever allowable, right? Clearly it can't go in the MLS. And I know we'll have some of those scenarios coming up, but yeah, because that offer of compensation's gone from the MLS, which was, a unilateral offer. You didn't have to do anything else. If it's in the MLS, that's what we would take under the old rules. Now we're going to be able to negotiate that. And so it should be memorialized in those contracts somewhere.
Yeah. Rebecca, are you seeing this being implemented differently in the state of Florida?
Yeah, so this, the way each state has interpreted this has been really interesting from a broker point of view because it is so different in each state. In Florida, our listing agreement still has the ability to do seller to buyer direct compensation, buyer agent compensation, or there is an option which we're urging against, seller to buyer broker to compensate, to seller's broker, sorry, to compensate buyer broker. We're trying to steer away from that. I think that's, a gray area in my opinion. But yeah, and then we have these new forms similar to what Jason probably has. It sounds like that if your seller opts for seller to broker compensation direct, there's now an additional addendum that goes along with that memorializes how that should be paid. So each state seems to have interpreted this quite differently, and it's been quite interesting to learn how the other states are dealing with it.
Yeah, I will say as a broad kind of brokerage operations team, here's our, as you're watching this and listening to this, here's our here's the North Star that we're looking at. We're looking at true decoupling of compensation. Therefore, we're saying, hey, stay as far away from broker to broker compensation as possible. You may say it's semantics, but optics and semantics and mechanics are very important, and that's what got us in this in the first place. So if there was a way that your state mechanism allows for seller-directed compensation, please use that path and stay away from broker-to-broker compensation. Real is not going to cause friction on a state-based law. If a state law allows to do something, Real is going to support that because we don't want to cause friction on that. But however, in the spirit of decoupling of compensation, we are all in alignment that stay close to decoupling as possible and use seller-directed compensation and not broker-to-broker compensation.
That's a good way to expand on that, Sharon. In California, when they released the revised form initially, it still had the broker-to-broker compensation. We also had an additional form that was called cooperating broker compensation. So, for example, in the old days, if there was maybe a lower commission offered in the MLS and the buyer broker wanted to ask for more, they could negotiate directly with the listing broker. That form has been eliminated. And again, all language in the new listing agreement regarding broker-to-broker compensation is gone. So smart way to look at it. Just move on.
I would wager to say within the next 6 months, Florida will have a revision. And I think our option A, as we have it right now, will be gone, and B and C, which is either, straight to the buyer broker or no compensation at all, is going to be the only two options. If I was a betting woman, I'd definitely go that way.
I would wager that too, Rebecca. And I'm actually going to, I want to say that this is the largest bundle of changes that we are seeing in probably the last 50 years that are happening in our industry. And the interpretation of these on a state-by-state basis is fairly complex. So while it seems simple for everyone to say, hey, oh yeah, this is decoupling of compensation, the implementation of it is difficult, and it's going to take a little bit of time. So we would all wager, exactly like Rebecca said, in the next 4 to 6 months, you will see some iterations in these documents and state practices that all gets us to a more stable place of new practice of real estate. So please lead with grace is all we would say on this one. Let's talk about this, Rebecca. How does this affect dual agency? It's very state dependent. Some states allow it, some states don't. But any comments around dual agency? And it's a little interesting for you because Florida is a strange state when it comes to dual agency.
Yeah, so for Florida, we're by default a transaction broker. So we don't have any agency changes at all in regards to the NAR settlement. It doesn't affect the way we can represent a buyer or a seller, other than that initial disclosure, obviously. But as far as agency, there are no changes in Florida specifically.
Yeah. Eric or Jason, I know this is a little different for California and New Jersey. Any comment on this one?
Yeah, I don't think there's really any changes other than once that buyer decides to hire you as their agent, you need to have the buyer rep agreement signed. I think that there's also, and this has always been the case with dual agency, people misinterpret or misunderstand exactly what it is. Most people think it's the same agent, one agent representing both the buyer and the seller, and it's actually one broker representing both parties. So it could be, Eric and I working together if we were in the same state at the same brokerage. He's got the buyer, I've got the seller. That's still dual agency because it's the same broker. But yeah, like Rebecca said, in terms of the agency disclosure, that everybody agrees and is aware of it, since it is legal in California. And then once that buyer decides to hire you to represent them, getting the buyer rep agreement signed at that point.
Yeah, perfect. Eric, I'm going to kick this one to you. Have you seen any process change related to signing new listing agreements as far as the new updates that have come from New Jersey?
So the August 17th is the key date, right? So if you have listing agreements in place pre the 17th, your NLSs have to make a disclosure that commissions are not regulated by law. If nothing's changing with how you're offering compensation from that listing agreement, don't really need an amendment. Just keep in mind that your listing agreements probably say you're going to put compensation on the MLS. So you're not doing that anymore. You technically should amend your listing agreements. New listing agreements, you just want to make sure they're in compliance. Every MLS is updating these at a different speed, and not all of them have been released. To make sure you're following the rules, even if the forms haven't quite caught up.
Yeah. Jason, Rebecca, this is a big one. Jason, I know that we have a couple of key fields that have been removed in California.
I put out today that today was the day. It's actually tomorrow, but we're trying to get ahead of it, where they're going to remove the compensation field for most of the MLSs in California. They will continue to have a concessions field. That's always been in there, but it's just a yes or no, indicating the seller is or is not willing to offer concessions, but no amounts or percentages go in there. It's just yes or no. And again, a concession could be covered buyer representative commission, or paint and carpet, or repair credits, or closing cost assistance, right? It could really be whatever's negotiated through the contract. But as it pertains to this question, there are process changes. We do have 2 new forms. So as of August 17th, as Eric mentioned, if you have existing listings or existing buyer rep agreements, those will need to be modified, and they did release modification forms for both of those. And it's strictly to bring those listings or agreements into compliance based on that MLS policy change. So the seller can still say yes or no to offer the seller directed compensation. So you can still market that, right? I think we have a question about that coming out in other places outside the MLS. But we do have the process change of making sure to get those active listings and buyer rep agreements updated to meet the new policies.
Yeah. I will say that the reason why we have this question in here is that it's different for each state. So please, when you see this question, just do a quick inventory of, hey, I have this listing. Do I need to change something, so you know the right process? That's why we have it in here, so you can get an update on the process. All right, Ms. Rebecca, I'll toss this last one to you. Have you seen if there are any rules that are in conflict with the state's implementation compared to the overall terms of the settlement?
Specifically in Florida, I haven't seen anything that is in conflict. I do believe some MLSs are perhaps interpreting the portion of the settlement that talks about direct or indirect feed through various places for the compensation. I think there are some that are sort of tiptoeing on the line for sure on what they're allowing, and I anticipate that will be, something that evolves and perhaps relooked at as implementation starts. But overall, we don't have any major juxtaposition between state laws and the NAR rules. No.
Yeah. I see this similar in all states. And this is another thing where the reason this is in here is when you talk to your state broker, or when you're at a broker conference, or if you're attending like a state-based seminar, ask them this question. because it's an interpretation thing, and it's okay. But at least it's good for you to know that this is what is happening overall. Jason, do you have something?
In California, the only thing they might be not in conflict, but there will be a new state law that will go into effect in January 1st, that will require all real estate licensees in California to use the buyer rep agreement. So even though it's an NAR thing now, California actually chose to make it a law. And it was interesting because it doesn't say to be used by all realtors. There are lots of real estate practitioners who are not realtors, are not members of the National Association of Realtors. So the law clearly states all real estate licensees. So it covers everybody that has a real estate license, which I thought was smart. The other thing that they did as part of that is our buyer rep agreement is a maximum 3 months. The state legislator wanted 6 months, and the California Association of Realtors wanted 1 month. So they kind of negotiated it out, and it's 3 months is the maximum length. It can be renewed as many times as you want, but each one can only be 3 months in length.
Yeah, so wild. All right, let's keep flying through this. So we've got this is the fancy stuff. We've got some compensation scenarios that I'm going to run through, which will be good for all because this is probably what you're thinking. So Eric, I'll get the first one to you. Is a seller required to offer buyer representation compensation?
No, and that's what got us in this trouble in the first place, right? Absolutely not. 100% negotiable on all sides.
Yeah, perfect. Exactly right. Mr. Rebecca, on this, can we offer buyer representation compensation in the MLS remarks, seller concession fields, or by putting secret links and keywords inside the MLS details?
Absolutely not. No. And I've seen a lot of people try and be creative. There's lots of memes online of ways you can do it. But you can display your compensation offered anywhere except the MLS. So, you can put it on your personal website, you can put it on your social medias, you can put it on the sign, I believe in some states at least. But as long as it's not in the MLS, and one of the key parts of that is it must be not indirect or direct from the MLS. So I think that's something people need to be very careful of, that it's not a link directing them from the MLS elsewhere. I think that's something that people are going to try and sneak in, or try and hide it in a concessions field as compensation. So no, the long answer is absolutely no.
Yeah, that's right. And by the way, the one thing that I will also offer is, as an investor, our suggestion would be, before you start blanketly advertising seller-directed buyer compensation, discuss that strategy with your seller. Hey, when should you offer it? Should you offer more? In a low inventory environment, maybe you don't need to offer it. Maybe you can only offer it when they come to the open house, or maybe you can offer it in the showing. Maybe you can offer it only when they call you. Just talk to your seller about the offering of it, because we've been used to this idea that we always showcase and advertise buyer representation compensation. It doesn't have to be that way. And because it was a unilateral version before, now it's a little different. It's all negotiated. So think about it from a perspective of strategy overall. Here's Lucky 13. What will, Eric, maybe to you, what will happen to existing listings in the MLS with offers of compensation that are currently in place?
Most MLSs are, there's a few national software providers. They're going to be removing, but it's still your responsibility, especially in remarks, to double check all your listings and remove anything that contains a compensation.
Yeah, spot on. All right. Jason, question for you. Can we do something as simple as saying on the MLS that commission is offered, or buyer agent friendly, or the things that, or the recent thing that I saw was, can we make the lockbox code 003? And I'm like, that's 3%. Like, you're getting super creative. So your thought on this one?
Yeah, my favorite one is in the remarks. People were talking about, hey, this house is X% better than any other home you're going to see, right? Yeah, the answer is no. As Rebecca mentioned, right? Any mention in the MLS in any way, shape, or form about commissions or anything like that is no longer going to be allowed. And by the way, I spoke with our largest MLS in California, the CR MLS, which is, I think, one of the largest in the country, if not the largest. There's no grace period on fines once that rule kicks in, which is tomorrow. It's an automatic, no appeals, $2,500 fine. And they wanted to make it strong enough that people wouldn't use it, like a loss leader and just say, well, I'll just pay the fine and keep doing this, right? But so just nothing in there at all about commissions. Should be listed.
Yeah. So
The interesting part of that, so in Florida, our compensation fields went away on the 6th, so we're already in action on this. And so we're already starting to see the warnings come in, and just like you, those fines are from the get-go. There is no warning. And actually our largest MLS is if you get 3 violations, it's a 6-month suspension.
Yeah.
From the MLS.
They're gonna play hardball. And I get it. Just follow the rules, man. This is the one area where don't find a loophole. Don't look for a loophole. Just follow the rules that are listed in the MLS.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Rebecca, maybe to you. Can buyers and buyer brokers rely on an offer of compensation that was on the MLS prior to the effective date of the changes?
I think that's case by case. I think in general, the guidance we're getting from our local associations is if it was offered prior, then you should be able to rely on it. But I think, to avoid any issues, I think that conversation has to be had. People are entitled to change their mind. So what you may have seen, like you said, ours went away on the 6th. So anything you saw prior to the 6th, there could have been some conversation between the seller's agent and the seller, and they may have signed something to revise it to the contrary. So I think you just need to have that open conversation between agents and find out what's being offered. I wouldn't make any assumptions.
The other strategy, I think, too, also there is if you feel like that transaction is shaky in some way, may not close for whatever reason, if it falls out, you're going to have to start over under the new rules. So you might want to use a modification of terms just to clarify what's happening in case it does fall apart and you've got to start over and be under the new rules at that point.
Jason's making a super great point. The one recommendation that we all have for you is that if there is a way to get compliant with a modification form or some agreement, do whatever it takes in your active stuff to get that in compliance, because not only is the going forward complex, the transition is ultra complex. And you're going to get no kind of respite for any of this. So please, if there is a simple modification that we need to do, please go ahead and do it so that you can protect your clients well. Eric, maybe I'll ask you this one. Are pending transactions when the commission field is removed still bound by the commission offered at the time of contract?
Sort of the same as the last question. It was offered in the MLS at a time where they were allowed to, so they should still be bound to it. Hopefully you had it documented somewhere, maybe an MLS printout, but it never hurts to get something in writing between you and the other agent, just confirming things.
Yeah, exactly right. Rebecca, for you, this is an interesting one, we've talked about this often, can a buyer request the listing broker to compensate the buyer broker?
May buyer request the listing broker to compensate? Yes, you can. It would be in the form of a concession, I would guess, agreed by the seller, but it's not what I would recommend in any way. I think we have to keep things separately. This is Florida specific. It is still an option, but me, as I'm putting my broker hat on and my legal hat, I would recommend staying well clear of any brokerage to brokerage compensation in all ways you can.
Yeah, and I think Rebecca mentioned this right off the bat from a concession, how a concession would work. A lot of people are like, hey, what is a concession? As you all know, as an agent, the consumers don't have the terminology that we do. They don't know what a concession is. And a concession is a modification to the terms of exchange. That's all this is, right? It's just an amendment to it. So that may be keeping the washer dryer, that may be, say, a lease bag, that may be keeping the furniture. It can be anything. But what Rebecca is sharing here is a concession is a seller offers some kind of terms or consideration to the buyer, then the buyer pays that directly to the buyer broker. So we're staying very clear, stay away from broker to broker compensation and go to seller or buyer directed compensation. Cool. That's perfect. Jason, for you, this is very similar. Can the listing broker, and we want to hit this home so hard because I want to say the 7 ways to say the same exact thing. Can the listing broker share commissions with the buyer broker based on the traditional terms of cooperation compensation?
Again, just stay away from it, I think. I mean, obviously, if it's an existing transaction that was, agreed on prior to the rule change, you're going to probably finish that out. But going forward, it should be seller-directed or buyer-directed compensation.
Yeah, perfect. And by the way, some of you agents may think, oh my gosh, Real or other brokers are unwilling to pay the buyer broker. No, no, no. Like, that's not what we're saying. We're just saying that it's seller directed or buyer directed. There's just no broker to broker sharing. So please don't think of it as, hey, Real or other brokers are not being buyer broker friendly. That's not what we're trying to do. We're just managing the flow of monies correctly. Eric, can a listing broker communicate offers of compensation on their own website or with IDX feeds or similar solutions?
An often misunderstood one. A listing broker can edit the data feed, the IDX feed, on their own listings only to include what their offer of compensation is. So very, very misunderstood. But yes, they can.
So, by the way, Eric just nailed that one. So if what we're talking about IDX broker fields, IDX feeds is when you get an IDX feed, generally speaking, you get access to all the properties on the market. And what Eric is specifically stating is that the listing broker can adjust and amend that IDX feed to only amend it for the listing broker's listings, so that on their website they can showcase the listing broker's listings and their intent to offer buyer compensation on the listing broker's listings alone, not on any other broker's listing. So super nuanced, but a great call out by Eric on this one.
I think on this as well, specifically as sort of a warning to people doing that, if they do choose to do it, is you need to remember, if something changes, you need to manually change that on the places you've manually inputted it. Otherwise you could be held to what they've seen elsewhere. Whereas we've always had this feed that has, whenever we've updated one place, it's fed through to all these. This is now going to rely on manual updates.
Yeah, absolutely right. Jason, let's try this one. Can the listing broker put references to offers of buyer compensation off the MLS, yard signs, property flyers, standalone marketing materials, video, email communications, etc., or maybe broker previews to office meetings? How do you kind of think about this?
Well, if it's off MLS, you can pretty much market it everywhere. I think I've seen sign writers already popping up on signs all over the place. I think the sign companies are going to have a field day with their new sign writers, X%, being offered or things like that. So yeah, as long as it's outside the MLS, it's totally fine. Again, in California, we do have language in the agreements that the seller authorizes the agent to do that. And communicate that. And as you mentioned, I love, we mentioned strategy a few times. There absolutely is a strategy to discuss with your sellers about whether or not they want to market that, right? I mean, it could attract more buyers because the agents know they're going to have that seller-directed compensation coming, but it may put the seller in a better position if you don't market it and just negotiate it strictly through the offer, right, as a concession. But yeah, you're free to market it anywhere outside the MLS.
Jason, let me ask you this, and maybe Eric and Rebecca can chime in on this one. I know that several agents right now are feeling a little pressure by saying, wait a minute, if I put this listing on the market, I'm probably going to get 50 phone calls, text messages, emails with inquiries regarding, what is being potentially offered as buyer representation compensation by the seller. How would you, and this feels overwhelming for a lot of agents because they have not had to do this in the past, how would you kind of advise an agent based on that feeling?
And again, it really comes back to that consultation with the seller and explaining what the pros and cons might be and how things kind of might work in this new world. And then what do they want to do, right? If they see the value in putting it out there because agents with the buyers know they can bring their buyers to those properties, and they're gonna have some compensation that's not going to be an issue, then great. But you might have some sellers who say, hey, look, I don't want to put it out there. I'm willing to consider it through the offer. So based on how that conversation goes, it's really as simple as the agent just communicating that based on what their seller is instructing them to do.
Yeah, so good. Rebecca, Eric, any comments on this one?
I think it's actually a good thing. I actually, when I have listings, I like to have that conversation with buyer agents. I want to make sure they're educated on what the house has and other things that may be pertinent to them. So I think, we do rely on technology a lot in this industry, but having that open conversation can create the rapport that can often get the deal across the finish line anyway. So I don't think it's daunting. I just think it's a new way we're going to have to operate.
Yeah. Awesome.
I was going to echo that sentiment. A lot of us are feeling stressed out. Let's instead focus on the opportunities, and having more conversations with our colleagues can only be a good thing. and that we can't even fathom right now, but there could be some really good things that come out of all of this. So try to be optimistic and look forward as we're going through all this together.
Yeah, great advice.
And to kind of cap that off, it's the what if scenarios that people have thrown out there, and that's kind of where some of the uncertainty comes from. If you look at it simply as this is really not any different than negotiating any other concession, right? Whether, hey, I've got an FHA loan, I need the seller to cover some of the closing costs for the buyer, right? I mean, it's kind of the same thing. And again, the strategy, I think one of the things we're going to see is the opposite of this, where we're going to see some buyers actually paying their buyer broker directly because it's going to make their offer stronger. It's going to net the seller more money if I don't have to put that on them and ask for them to cover it. So there's going to be a period of time in the next few months where we'll see things kind of play out and we'll have a better handle on things going forward. But we're not going to know for sure until we wait and see.
I will share this, and Jason, I share this with you because I'm in California. As a investor, with these new rules coming up just last week, we got a great deal on an investment property, and I paid buyer-directed buyer agent compensation because I was getting a deal on the property, and I wanted our offer to stand out. And the seller was like, "Wait a minute, you're the only offer that did not request a seller-directed buyer compensation." And so I was able to pull off this deal, which I would have not gotten otherwise, and the math penciled on that. But the opposite is true as well, and I want to offer this as an idea for agents. Please, if you get a call from a buyer broker or buyer agent saying, "Hey, is the seller offering buyer representation compensation?" Based on the strategy that you've accepted with the seller, you should feel confident in answering that question. If you and your seller have decided not to provide that information, you can say, "Hey, our seller is open to paying buyer representation compensation based on the terms of the offer." You're not required to give away anything that you and your seller have not agreed to. So the hard part becomes us not knowing what to say to the buyer agents in the marketplace in fear that we're going to destroy some relationships, but that is not the case anymore. So just agree upon whatever you want to agree upon with your seller and then execute on that authorization. So awesome. A couple more. Ms. Rebecca, the listing agent does not have to disclose their fee agreed upon in the listing agreement to the buyer broker. That's between the listing agent and the seller. But does the buyer broker now have to disclose the buyer agent compensation fees to the listing broker as part of the offer by sharing a full copy of the buyer representation agreement?
To my knowledge right now, the answer to that is no. We don't, as the buyer agent, we don't ask to see the listing agreement. So the listing agent really shouldn't need to see the agreement between the buyer and the buyer's agent. I don't believe it benefits anyone to see that. I think that's a personal agreement between those two parties. So no, at this time, it is not necessary to share that information. If you choose to, if you think that would be beneficial to some part of the transaction, then I don't think there's any harm in doing so. Certainly no rule against it in Florida, but I just don't see it as necessary.
Rebecca, say along the same lines of this, we're starting to see some listing agents on the request for a showing ask for a copy of the buyer agreement. How do you respond to that?
I think most of the scaredness of this is lack of information or misinformation. And I think that's what's driving a lot of this sort of retaliatory friction that we're seeing between listing agents and buyer agents. I think, you try and diffuse the situation. You say, yes, we do have a signed buyer broker agreement. I'd be more than happy to provide that once we get to the offer terms, if that's something that's required. But yes, we do have something in place, and try and move forward and get the showing booked.
Yeah, I think what Rebecca said was so great. You can say, "Hey, yes, we do have a written agreement between us and our buyer, and we're happy to present that as part of the terms of the offer." Like, just be super clean about it, and that way you don't start to get into a hey, how dare this other person ask me for something, right? Because there's going to be a lot of us figuring out these new practice changes. So
I think there's a lot of agents sort of getting tangled up in the weeds of enforcement. And I think we need to step out of that and just stay in our lane, so to speak. If you're representing the buyer, do what's best for them. And if you're representing the seller, do what's best for them. And either party, the best option is to get those consumers into the house to see the house. So
yeah.
And the second part of the question, though, in this, I don't know if this will end up being a state-by-state thing, but I do know that if requested, the buyer broker does need to provide at least the confirmation piece. And in California, in the buyer rep agreement, it's one little section that just shows the amount of compensation the buyer had agreed to with their buyer's agent to just verify. Because if the buyer rep agreement is less than what the seller might have been willing to offer, you have to accept what's in the buyer rep agreement. So as a listing agent, you're going to want to, at some point, not prior to showing, but with the offer, provide that confirmation of what the buyer had agreed to in the buyer rep agreement, and make sure it matches up with what the seller is willing to pay. Otherwise, you might end up getting less.
Yeah, so good. Eric, question for you. What happens in the situation where we make an offer on, say, an off-market listing like a pocket or an expired or a for sale by owner?
That's kind of how we've been doing for sale by owners all these years, right? Is the way we're learning to do it with regular sellers.
Exactly right.
Where we have to call the seller and ask if they're offering anything or willing to pay our fee on behalf of our buyer. If the buyer wants that. Negotiate that and then put it in writing somehow. So we're going, it's the opposite. We've been doing FSBOs this way. Now we're doing it with everything.
Well, this is perfect, and there's a reason for this question here, and Eric nailed the answer, because the process with the FSBOs actually completely explains decoupling of compensation. And so, because we know that there's no representation on one side, so the compensation is intrinsically decoupled, and that's why this is really important to know. So, so perfect answer on that one. Eric, one more to you. In the buyer-broker agreement, can a buyer and buyer-broker agree to a range of compensation?
No, and I know the agents are tempted to do this or add a disclaimer, whatever the seller is offering, as long as it's a minimum of X. But no, under the terms of the settlement, has to be some sort of fee that, an attorney reading that agreement would be able to figure out what the buyer would owe. So it has to be a definite percent or fee or combination.
So good. Exactly right. Last two. Jason, for you, is the listing broker required to share, we talked about this briefly, is the listing broker required to share all the details if asked by the buyer broker if the seller is offering buyer representation compensation?
No, it depends on what your listing agreement says and what your seller instructed you to do or not to do. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. And I think as we talked about before, please, you should have this conversation. The strategy of advertising the offers for buyer representation compensation is a very important part of the listing strategy. Normally, we never had to talk about that because there was a unilateral offer for buyer representation compensation or cooperation compensation. Now it's not that. So having especially you as a listing agent in this market, standing out and having that conversation with the seller is a huge advantage. So please have the strategy conversation around that. All right, Ms. Rebecca. What if the buyer specifically states that they do not want to be responsible for paying the buyer commission?
So this is a really interesting question because the thing that we should lead with is obviously the NAR settlement, but we also have the ethical responsibility of being a realtor as well. So you have an ethical responsibility to not show your buyer properties. However, if your buyer specifically states that they do not wish to see a home that is not offering buyer representation compensation, and they put that in writing to them, then you can go by what they say. But my sort of caution on this is everything's negotiable. So just because the seller is not offering compensation at this time, and if you think that house is perfect for the buyer, then I would still encourage them to see it. And, if they come through with a really strong offer, the seller may be open to compensation. So I hate to eliminate it for that reason, but the legal answer is yes, if they've instructed you not to, but I think there's ways around to make sure they see all the homes that might be right for them.
I actually think, Rebecca, you nailed this one. And this is a really, really important part of just being a fiduciary, doing what's in their best interest, even though normally when we talk to potential buyers, the reason why they don't want to come out of pocket to pay buyer representation compensation themselves, buyer directed, is because it may affect the amount of funds they bring to the table on what they can actually afford from a purchasing power perspective. So if that means that they can afford less, they probably are going to have a different set of homes that they're going to buy. If our job is to say, hey, if we can find a home that you want at a price that you want, the terms that you want, let's go through the offer process and then figure out in the contractual negotiation if we can get what we want. I think buyers will really appreciate hearing that from us, but they know that we want to limit or not pay buyer representation compensation. But that does not, what we talk about that is, we call it steering, just because a certain amount of commissions not being paid to the buyer, you don't show them that property. That used to happen, or it was alleged it happened before, but now, if the buyer is giving you written authorization to do that, we still recommend that you advise them that there may be an opportunity to work through it contractually in negotiation. So great advice by Rebecca.
And I think that's a skill
this is interesting because there is in our forms in California, there's actually language in the buyer rep agreement that the buyer can say, hey, I don't have the money to pay you, right? And we also have a new form that's the buyer's financial information form. And this is an interesting one with our CAR, California Association of Realtors Attorneys, during their training, was if you choose to use that form with your buyers for them to kind of tell you where they are financially, use it with every buyer. Don't pick and choose what buyers you offer that form to, because that could be considered a fair housing issue. So it might create more problems than we want. So show them all. Yeah. Show all the homes.
Let's do a quick round of just maybe some. What is the one piece of advice, if you could give it to mainly agents that work with you in your state? Because I know you know your state laws very well. Maybe Eric, we'll start with you. What is one piece of advice that you could give them? Both, it can either be process or know-how centric, or more strategy and mindset centric. What one piece of advice that you'd give agents to navigate this world?
So my mindset centric, and I kind of realized this concept recently, but if you were driving from New York to Philadelphia, there's a few different routes you could take, but at the end of the day, you still arrive in Philadelphia. So the end result is not changing. Buyers are buying homes, buyer brokers will get compensated fairly. Okay, it's just the roadmap is changing.
Yeah.
The path that we take to get there. So don't let it stress you. Be optimistic and master that roadmap, and you'll be fine.
Yeah, so good. Jason, what one piece of advice for you as agents kind of go through these changes?
I think it's just realizing that it's really two big changes, right, that are happening. They're removing compensation from the MLS, right? So that's going to be different. And you got to have a buyer representation agreement. There are multiple versions of that based on each scenario that you might encounter. But I would say be proactive in terms of understanding the rules in your state and what all this is going to mean. And you should be fine. And don't play the what if game. Like, just have the conversations. Come to Sharon's session on the 14th and really learn deeper some of the strategy and talking points and conversations that you should be having. And going forward, it's like everything else that changes. That's the only constant in our business is change.
Yeah, so good. Ms. Rebecca, bring us home, please.
My tip would be to sharpen skills that we maybe have let get a little loose recently, and that is learn how to structure an offer and how to negotiate. The structure of an offer is going to be so important in this market going forward. And I think there are too many agents who don't have the experience on how to structure an offer and how the end result can be got by many. It's similar to what Eric said. You can go many different routes on how to get to the end result and make a buyer and seller happy. But having that knowledge on how to structure an offer and negotiate is going to be a skill that if I was picking up a new skill right now or practicing a skill, that would be my probably top 5 skills to perfect right now.
So good. And Rebecca and I did not plan this, but I'm excited to share with you that while we do our training sessions, I'm actually going to break down for you the 5-star offer formula. Like, what are the 5 key components of actually breaking down an offer, and how as a listing agent, you can explain to a client that it's not just about getting that price they want for their home, but there's other components that strengthens the offer. And also to the buyer, when you're representing the buyer realizes that they just can't, offering one term, which is purchase price, is not it. There's actually 4 other components that allow you to get a really strong offer. So I'm super excited to share the 5-star offer formula with you. But most importantly, I'll say this one thing, and that is our clients are at a major disadvantage if we don't know the rules of the game or we don't have the skills to help them. And that's what really hits me, because I believe that our process is so complex. There's so many things that happen. I call this the diffusion of optics, where outside looking in, it looks like what our agent does is very simplistic. But having been in several different professions, like having been a banker on Wall Street, having run a technology company, having run a private equity firm, running Real right now, I've realized that all of those were so easy compared to what an agent does, but because you're bringing together so many power players to get a transaction done. So I would offer to you that our clients are at a major disadvantage if we don't know the rules of the game or we don't have the skills to help them. So on behalf of the entire leadership team, Eric and Jason and Rebecca, I want to thank you for your leadership. I want to thank you for digging into helping us navigate this environment. And there's so many firms, brokers, leaders who are just saying, hey, we'll figure it out. But these are some of the most complex changes that are hitting our industry in 50 plus years. So I'm so grateful to be partners with you, and thank you for guiding us through this process overall.
Thank you.
For having us, Sharon.